Hi, welcome to Rhythms for Life. I'm Gabe Lyons,
And I'm Rebekah.
and we're so glad that you are with us today for this conversation that's going to be so important on the state of marriage and on why marriage is so important. And we're going to get to talk to an amazing sociologist who describes for us what are the benefits in society for marriage and for couples. He's the author of the book Get Married: Why Americans Must Defy the Elites, Forge Strong Families, and Save Civilization. It's such a wonderful read. Brad, thank you so much for being with us today.
Good to be with you, Gabe and Rebecca.
Yes, I remember texting our kids a photo of this cover. And I said, well, guys, it looks like it's on you to save civilization. And it
Right.
got a little bit of a chuckle, but it's true. Our kids are in their young 20s. They're both in relationships that are serious. And just to have you normalize this conversation once again, I think every generation needs to hear a new refrain of the value of the covenant and longevity and generational lines. And so thank you for writing this work.
Yeah, so let's just jump in, Brad, and tell us, for those who've not read the book or maybe haven't heard some of your work, just the thesis of this project that ended up with you claiming that this is how we're going to save civilization.
Sure. Thanks, Rebecca. Thanks, Gabe. So I kind of came to this whole topic because I was raised by a single mom and kind of just done a lot of work underlying the ways in which kind of marriage is that kind of keystone institution that connects, men to their children, not just in our country and not just in our civilization, but really, across many different civilizations across time and space, if you will. And so that's been kind of part of like the genesis of my work is trying to, basically understand and to articulate how much marriage matters for kids, if you will.
Mm.
But as I've been talking to students at the University of Virginia and talking to a lot of young women in general about their kind of views about relationships and men and marriage, I've just kind of detected a lot of concern about kind of where we're headed when it comes to relationships, where men and, are often seen to be kind of floundering and not worthy of marriage,
Mm.
and just becoming convinced that we need to also kind of articulate why marriage matters for adults and kind of give both women and men a kind of motivation to invest in the kinds of virtues and the kinds of skills that would make them good boyfriends, good girlfriends, and then, good wives and husbands and fathers, and mothers as well. So that's kind of where this book began to take me towards kind of the value of marriage for women and men. And then two, to think about how much marriage matters for civilization. And I'm sitting here at UVA, Thomas Jefferson's University. Obviously, Jefferson's famous for a lot of different things, but he's also, I think, particularly famous for those words about the importance of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as kind of core American civilizational values, if you will. And when it comes to those three core values, what I'm seeing in the research, when it comes to life, for instance, is that we've been witnessing in recent decades just an incredibly sobering rise in what are called deaths of despair, Gabe and Rebecca, where literally hundreds of thousands of Americans, primarily working class men, are committing suicide, overdosing from drugs, or dying from alcohol poisoning. It's just record numbers. And what we see in the research is that really the number one factor in some new research by Jonathan Rothwell at Gallup, an economist, is the share of unmarried adults, in
Mm.
communities across the U.S. is like a huge predictor of these deaths, particularly for guys. When it comes to the sort of liberty piece, our founders sort of saw liberty in terms of economic opportunities. So I think about that in terms of the American dream. And we see work from Raj Chetty at Harvard talking about how basically the number one predictor of mobility for poor kids rising from poverty as a child to affluence as an adult at the community level is the share of two-parent families
Mm.
in the community. So kind of just a sense that like what happens in our homes really matters for the health of the American dream. And then the final piece, the pursuit of happiness piece, we've seen kind of record number of Americans saying that they're not kind of all that happy with their lives, in recent years. And there's new work from an economist at Chicago kind of telling us that from his analyses, the number one factor that accounts for this decline in happiness in America, the fact that fewer Americans are realizing that classic Jeffersonian the pursuit of happiness can be attributed to the fact that fewer Americans are married today. So
Good.
just kind of seeing it in my work and in the book in particular, how much kids are more likely to thrive, women and men are more likely to thrive, and
Yeah.
our civilization is on a better footing when, marriage as
Mhm.
institution is kind of also flourishing as well.
As someone who's been knee deep in the mental health space for the last 15 years, I think it's interesting how you're talking about this. The age of individualism has also led to the age of isolation. And that loneliness and that isolation often yields depression that then can escalate to ruminating thoughts or intrusive thoughts or toxic thoughts that can take a life, that can truly overcome someone when their brain has no other brain to respond to remind them what is true, to pull them out of those thoughts, those toxic thought patterns. I would love to talk about marriage since the me decade. Like, what
Sure.
define what you mean by that and what does that mean for us right now?
So in the book, I talk a lot about kind of how I think one of the cultural currents that's kind of been harmful for love and marriage and family life is what a lot of us in sociology call kind of the me decade of the 1970s, where a kind of expressive individualism took hold. And a lot of Americans kind of began to think the point of life was not living for one's faith, wasn't living for one's family, was kind of living for your own individual desires, often in the moment. And this was, coined again by Thomas Wolfe, that famous American writer, in a cover story for a major magazine, the Me Decade. And it's no accident, Rebecca, that in that decade, we just see an incredible spike in divorce
Yeah.
as, more and more, I think, husbands and wives were kind of looking at their marriage through the kind of prism, through the lens of, does this relationship make me happy?
Mm.
Am I fulfilled, at this moment in time as a wife and mother or as a husband and father? And if there was a sense that this wasn't the most, fulfilling relationship or the most fulfilling family context, again, in this kind of me first decade, women and men were kind of heading for the exits from their marriage in record numbers. And I think that kind of the tragedy here in part, right, is that this was often bad for their spouses and their kids and their communities. But one point that I'm trying to make also in the book as well is that what we see, I think, at least today from my own research, is that kind of living a more family first ethic where you're trying to kind of
Mm.
put the welfare of your spouse, and the welfare of your marriage and your kids as a kind of primary goal, like where you recognize that love is not a feeling, Rebecca. It's about kind of doing or advancing the good of the other. This is kind of a rough paraphrase of what St. Thomas Aquinas would say about love. But this is the pathway, not just towards being a good spouse, but towards living a meaningful and generally happy life. And so what we see in my research is that husbands and wives who look at marriage as an opportunity to kind of make a gift of themselves towards their spouse and kids, who have this more family first as opposed to a me first approach to marriage, are not only more stably married, but also oftentimes more happily married.
Mm.
Because, that kind of dying to self that we see articulated in the gospel does correspond to something kind of deep within us in ways that generally, but not always, tend to bring us greater joy and even, and greater happiness as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, it seems the cultural narrative explains to young people today that getting married is going to be the worst thing for you. You're going to end up unhappy, or especially for women, you're not going to be able to have freedom. You'd be economically better off to not be connected to someone else. And it seems all the research is completely the opposite that you're reporting on. Could you just relay a few of those data points that maybe surprised you, or as you saw them, you said, man, this makes it very clear that even if our society feels like it's changing its values, marriage is still holding up.
Yeah, great question. So what we see kind of, in recent media commentary, for instance, I was actually finishing up the manuscript and there was a a headline trending in Twitter from Bloomberg. It said that women who stay single and don't have kids are getting richer. And not only did this sort of article suggest that kind of the path to prosperity for women ran away from family, not towards it, It also kind of depicted a number of women who were single and childless, kind of living their best lives. One woman, for instance, Ashley, whose profile kind of has a home in New York City and a home in the Jersey Shore, and just she says of life, I love my life and feel very fulfilled. So you kind of got the sense from this Bloomberg piece that not only was kind of marriage a kind of a negative pathway for prosperity, but kind of family was negative emotionally for women. And yet we see in the data is that women who are married, for instance, have about 9 times the assets as their single peers as they kind of head towards retirement in their 50s. They're about 80% less likely to be poor too, even controlling for factors like, race and education and age, as adults. So the kind of financial piece that Bloomberg was asserting was clearly factually wrong. But more importantly, kind of the idea that marriage might be an obstacle to realizing your best life emotionally is also wrong.
Mm.
There was also kind of a piece in the New York Times by Amy Shern that said that married motherhood in America is a game no one wins around this time as well.
Hmm.
And what we see in the data is that women who are married with kids are almost twice as likely to be very happy with their lives compared to women who are single and childless. And there's kind of a pretty similar story too for men. And that's a point worth noting here because we're seeing as well, obviously, voices now on the right, like Andrew Tate, who are telling guys that there is, quote, zero statistical advantage to marriage for men. So voices now on the left and also on the right have kind of emerged that are kind of arguing that marriage is a bad deal for women on the left and for men on the right. But both of them kind of miss the sort of typical picture, which is that men and women are more likely to flourish both financially and emotionally when they're married with kids.
Yeah, that's interesting. Just think of the scripture, it is better to give than receive, right? Like there's this unequivocal blessing that comes when you are generous in spirit towards someone else. Like there's just a reward that you just something that's happening even in your brain that you're like that there's something about that felt significant, the sacrifice of ourselves for someone else. And it's very primal for women. I'm a mother of four, three biological and then adopted 7 years ago. And so there is something that's there was a when we lived in New York City about 15 years ago, there was an article that kept circling around, and I know it's not a new phrase, but it would keep coming back around. Can women have it all? Can we really have it all? And all meant, can we have a career that's lucrative and flourishing? Can we have a marriage that's fantastic and connected? Can we have kids that are thriving, that we have capacity for and time for? And can women do this without being exhausted and overwhelmed and despairing? And I just remember in that season, I was tackling some of my own, like I had panic attacks in that first year of living in New York City. I had just begun to write for the first time and then start to teach around mental health. And I was a little bit perplexed, like maybe not. I'm not sure that we can. I don't know if we can and flourishing, but what I know now, even 28 years into marriage, is like you don't have it all at the same time every day. You're right. Like that's just the math doesn't add up. Like you've got 24 hours to do things well. And I think there's not enough grace that women give themselves to going like, you don't have to be killing it in every category in every minute. The pressure of that is insurmountable, just like men would feel in deaths of despair. Like we're kind of trying to put ourselves at this level that's it's not attainable, it's not practical, and then we feel like we're failing if we're not just thriving in all of those ways. So how would you talk to women specifically like myself who are like we're trying to put our best foot forward. We want healthy meals for our kids. We want to have some agency at home. We want to raise kids that respect the value of family and marriage. We also want them to learn, and we want myself and my spouse to kind of be running in the lane that we feel like we were made for. But yet also having the permission to press pause in every season of life, our kids' seasons, our marriage seasons, and go like maybe we're just biting off too much all at the same time. What would you say to that?
Yeah, I think Rebecca, it's a nice way to formulate like you did in terms of understanding and appreciating for women, but also for men too, that there is, there are different seasons or different chapters in our lives. And I think it's hard for anyone, be he a husband or be she a wife, to have everything, at the same point in time. And so to recognize that when you have young children, there are many women who kind of want to prioritize, the care of their baby and their toddlers in ways they're going to have them at home full time or just working part time. And that's, I think, an important season for them as mothers and for their kids to forge that primary attachment.
Mhm.
And then as kids get older, some women are going to work, part time or full time, and kids are in school often, or some women are going to recognize that, for them and for their kids, they just still need, their moms to kind of be with them and for them, as they navigate adolescence and all the challenges and opportunities that brings in that season of their life.
Mhm.
But then, as kids fly the nest, there may be opportunities too to move back into the paid labor force in ways that are meaningful and valuable and kind of allow women to kind of realize that the kind of talents that they've been given have a kind of professional application. And I can certainly report that many of my peers are just dying to kind of hire women who've been the mothers of large families because they tend to be
Mm.
really efficient and really gifted at kind of running operations and, managing a number of different, challenges at the same time. So
Yeah.
I think just recognizing that our culture kind of often holds at what I call kind of like the Midas mindset out. And it's the kind of idea that what really matters is your education, money, building your own brand, and above all, your career or your work.
Mm.
And tends to minimize the importance of love and marriage and family as kind of core commitments and concerns. And I think it's important for both women and men to realize that both in the moment and across a lifetime, what matters more for us is, this sort of marriage mindset, broadly defined in terms of love and marriage and family, not the Midas mindset. So that's what I would say in brief to, you know, women who are listening to your podcast.
Well, and I would also say, the thing I love about your approach to this is it gives us a high level macro view of just the institution of marriage and what it means for society, what it means for children and parents and the whole of society. So it's a little bit less about, hey, how are we getting along?
Mhm.
It's a little more high level of, no, this institution matters. Like if you're in a
Right.
marriage, which is why Rebecca and I are so passionate about this idea of fighting for your marriage, like, it matters not just for the 2 of you and your happiness, while we know that'll be a part of it, but the impact, the effect that this has at a very broad level that most of us don't even have the eyes to see. You help illuminate that. You talk about these factors that lead to human flourishing based on marriage. Would you describe a few of those that are significant for us to recognize?
So I think, the basic idea here is that, a lot of Americans think, Gabe, as you mentioned, that kind of marriage is just kind of an individual or a couple based, or maybe even, kind of relevant for them and their kids. And they don't appreciate all the ways in which, as you kind of look at marriage through the prism of, sociology and anthropology and economics and even psychology, that what happens in our homes matters for the welfare of our friends and our neighborhoods and our cities and towns and our states and for our country more generally, hence the point about civilization in my book. And so, when the family is flourishing, adults and kids are more likely to flourish. And so, we see in my book, for instance, on just looking at boys, there's a lot of concern today about kind of the welfare of boys in our culture, the welfare of young men in our culture. And probably the most surprising and sobering statistic or set of stats for me in looking at the kind of kid angle in the book was just finding that for boys today, Gabe, what we see is that young men who are raised in any kind of non-intact family, could be a single mom, could be a single dad, step family, um, adoptive family, those young men are more likely to spend some time in prison or in jail
Mm.
than they are to graduate from college. And so that kind of just tells us that when it comes to sort of flourishing, socially, avoiding trouble with the law, flourishing educationally, our boys are much more likely to be, doing well today when they have the benefit of their own mom and dad, at home, kind of in their corner. So that's sort of one example of flourishing. When it comes to, um, happiness, as I mentioned before, for women, there's a clear story. For men, it's an even stronger story that men are more likely to be happy with their lives when they're married fathers compared to being single and childless or unmarried dads. And they're also more likely to report that their lives, Gabe, are meaningful. So these would be kind of different marks of flourishing for men in this case. But you can look at kind of almost any major health, social, emotional, financial outcome, and kind of just see that that marriage and family life, have considerable benefits today for both women and men.
You talk about one of these advantages is bridging the gender divide. Would you elaborate on that for a minute?
Yeah, so I think one of the challenges facing us today is that a lot of young men are drifting to the right, culturally and politically, and a lot of young women are drifting to the left, politically and culturally. That's sort of one
Mm.
example of the kind of gender divide. And yet, when women and men are dating and they're married to one another, I think they're able to see kind of up close and personal, how the opposite sex looks at a set of issues. And I think that can be a kind of a moderating force, both culturally and politically, in our common life together. I think it's also the case too that you tend to look at, um, your experience of life in a different way, and your experience of for instance, your child's life in a different way when you are married and together rather than, say, parenting separately. So my wife can see things about how our kids are flourishing or floundering differently than I can, and I can see sort of different things about how they're doing well or poorly as well that are different than what she would kind of perceive.
Mhm.
Even when it comes to like the workplace, for instance, my wife has insights into kind of political dynamics in play at my workplace that I don't, when I'm kind of relating things to her that I don't have, insight into. And I think the same thing is true for her in terms of talking about some of her dynamics at work as well. So just, I think, women and men do tend to see the world a little bit differently. And so there's a benefit from us kind of coming together and being in communion with one another. And that benefits our friendships, our roles as parents, our roles in the workplace, and then also oftentimes our roles in the church as well.
Yeah, there's definitely a sharpening or a rounding out of just one brain in the room, right? Like when you've got get us together and have a different perspective, like those are always going to be insights that grow our own. They kind of give us a broader vision of something.
Yeah. You describe also these myths that a lot of people have bought into about marriage that might keep a younger person from getting married or taking that step or early because you're a supporter of people early on considering that marriage commitment, making it earlier than later. But you talk about these myths of the flying solo myth, the soulmate myth, and the gen or
Family diversity.
the family diversity myth. And I wonder if you could dispel those myths today for us and for those younger people listening that aren't sure if marriage is for them.
Yeah, so I mentioned that there was this New York Times piece a little while ago that said that married motherhood in America is a game no one wins. It's written by a writer in Brooklyn. There's a lot of pieces in the New York Times by writers from Brooklyn. You guys, since you spent time in New York, might have a better sense about what's wrong with Brooklyn. I don't know, but there's so much stuff coming out of Brooklyn that's like not very family friendly. There's a new book, for instance, called More about polyamory. It's making the case for polyamory, written by another writer from Brooklyn. So there's just something about Brooklyn. But seriously, on the sort of flying solo myth, there's just kind of like this idea out there that we see in a lot of journalistic and social media and even academic outlets that kind of is basically suggesting that living a more autonomous way of life, basically atomized way of life, a life free of the encumbrances of family life is really the way to go. I think it doesn't really appreciate that, yeah, certainly being a spouse and being a parent can be stressful, can be hard, can require a lot of sacrifice. Um, I think we all know that our relationships are often very challenging, and I think your book is kind of touching on that as well. But at the same time, like we know from everything from Aristotle to any number of passages from the Bible and the Gospels in particular that kind of our relationships with others end up being what's most important to us. And
Yeah.
there's also, you know, a longitudinal study at Harvard that kind of talks about tracking first men and then later women over their life, and finding that as they hit their 70s and 80s, they kind of look back, and these are including Harvard graduates, like they just report like the most important, dimensions of their life revolve around their friendships and their family relationships, especially their marriages. So I think people just have to understand and appreciate that kind of living with and for others, and for most of us, marriage is the most important opportunity to do that, is what brings us the most meaning and joy and happiness. And the data certainly correspond
Hmm.
to that, in the sense that for most people, marriage is linked to greater reports of meaning and happiness and less loneliness. And there's nothing that I see in the data that's a better predictor of happiness than a good marriage. So that's worth, I think, keeping in mind in reference to the sort of flying solo myth. When it comes to this, the sort of the second one you mentioned, the family diversity myth, in kind of in my world, in sociology, for instance, there are a lot of people who'd be articulating this idea that what matters for kids is not the form of their family, but whether or not, their parents or their caretakers are loving and have enough financial resources. So what matters for kids is love and money and not marriage, to kind of put it in sort of a more pithy way. And it is true, if you were to look at kind of like a predictor of child outcomes, like if you had a good measure of affection and a good measure of attentive parenting and a good measure of like, consistent discipline, those would be like better predictors in a model of most child outcomes than whether or not their parents were married. And it's also true that, avoiding poverty is typically linked to better outcomes for kids as well. But what I point out in the book is that generally speaking, Rebekah and Gabe, kids who are being raised by their own married parents get, get more attention, they get more affection, they get more consistent discipline, and they have more money, from their parents. So stable marriage tends to generate, just more financial security, more time for the kids, a more affectionate context, and a place too where discipline is sort of given out in a more consistent
Mm.
and authoritative way, all of which benefit kids. So the point is that, kids are just much more likely to flourish today in stably married parent families. And that's the kind of point that's obscured by the celebration of family diversity. That's the second. Now, sorry, Gabe, what was the third?
Soulmate.
This,
Yeah, well,
yeah.
this idea of being a soulmate that so many people buy into, that like I've not met the person yet, or I met the person and then we broke up, so I'm not sure I could ever
Or
find my soulmate.
yeah.
Yeah, in fact, I'm just pulling up a note from my class today. I was talking about this in my sociology family class today. And I think what we see often in the sort of in many of our songs, in many of our movies, and some books, I talk about the book Eat, Pray, Love as an example of this, kind of this idea being articulated that, you know, marriage is all about kind of like this intense romantic or erotic or emotional connection with someone, and that you're kind of expecting that your marriage is going to be frictionless. You're going to always be kind of in touch with one of those feelings. You're going to have those butterflies, in your stomach at almost all times. And of course, anyone who's been in a long-term, marriage knows that that's, not true. The butterflies kind of fly away at some point. They come back oftentimes, but they do tend to fly away as well. And if you're kind of making feelings the foundation of your marriage, you're likely, I think, to land in divorce court. Um, and you're also often, I think, likely to be not very happy to, because I think you've got a kind of an unrealistic view about marriage. But in my class today at EVA, I was just talking about this woman named Tanya, who was interviewed by a colleague of mine at the Institute for Family Studies. And Tanya is you know, a married mother of two, living in Ohio, but she tells my colleague that she's leaving her husband of 9 years for her neighbor. And that's not because her husband had done anything wrong, really. She says about her husband, I love him, but I'm not in love with him. She says, I love him as a friend, as the father, but I don't feel that connection as I used to, like, not at all. She was honest, there's just a big difference between loving somebody and being in love with somebody. And she thinks that kind of marriage requires kind of being in love with somebody. She says, you want to get the butterflies, when they're at work, you can't wait to see them, can't wait till they come home walking through the door. So this is kind of an example of someone who's kind of embraced the soulmate model of love. And so as a consequence, she's leaving her husband and leaving her two kids, at least in part of the time, because she's looking for the soulmate model with her her neighbor down the road. And I'm, suggesting that that's not really great for your husband, for the kids, for your community to have that kind of approach, but also that people don't realize that this more soulmate approach to love is not sustainable. And, I talk about how the author of Eat, Pray, Love, Liz Gilbert, who kind of, I think, embodies the soulmate approach to love, goes just through a number of relationships and marriages over the course of her life. And by last media report was kind of living single in her 50s, without, I would say, the benefit of a husband, or some kind of lifelong love, because she looks at, both love and marriage through this kind of prism of the soulmate, rather than sort of recognizing, as I argue in the book, that, love is about kind of willing the good of the other and recognizing that you, are supposed to be committed to your spouse and to your marriage and to your family. You've got obligations, and that paradoxically kind of recognizing your obligations, living them out well, tends to be not just conducive to a stable marriage, but also generally to a more happy marriage, because you see that marriage and family are a way to kind of pursue a number of goods, and not just romance, but, financial security, being part of a larger kinship network, and then most importantly, kind of serving the good of your spouse.
Right. When you think about dating and those exciting seasons, everything was new, everything was novel. You were always like experiencing something that would foster and cultivate those butterflies. But over time, what used to be like an insane connection, all of a sudden, like 2 years, 3 years down the road, you're like, this is just a Tuesday, right? Like this is like a normal Tuesday. We know each other, we get each other. It does like all the love and the foundation is there, but the excitement is just like, no, it's like normalized. And somehow that dopamine drops and you just think, well, maybe it's just not enough when, like you said, it's not sustainable. And I don't think it's meant at that intensity level to be sustainable, because really what is forged instead of just the butterflies is this formation of like, we're not going anywhere. Like we're gonna stay in this, and we're gonna walk through valleys. Our first child was born 3 years in, and 6 hours later, we said the doctor said, we see signs of Down syndrome in your baby. And so we were in our mid-20s birthing our very first child, our entree to parenting with a special needs son. And we just cried. Like we didn't know what we were doing. We didn't see it
Sure.
coming. We didn't know how to navigate that. I can't imagine having to do that alone, because at least we had each other and we had God, and we were able to fortify in many ways that covenant, because we're like, we're not going anywhere. Like this is going to take the reserves of both of us to try something new and to learn something and walk through something that's difficult.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes what happens in these seasons is they hit a roadblock or they hit something that's disruptive, and instead of turning toward one another, they almost like isolate or they turn away from one another. That's why those stats go up with special needs parents that divorce, or whatever those roadblocks are, they kind of like miss each other. What have you found in data, or even just like interviews that has allowed people to fortify their marriage perhaps in those challenging times versus drift away?
Yeah, Rebecca, those are just incredibly, I think, important points you're making. We just had a piece in Family Studies, which is the blog that the Institute for Family Studies, maintains, from a couple who are kind of family experts, and they were just talking about how the long-term couples that they've been studying, Rebecca, who've kind of navigated, profound challenges, and the most kind of heart-wrenching challenge that they mentioned was the loss of a child, the death of a child. But the couples who kind of managed to navigate those difficulties successfully were couples who kind of turned to one another rather than kind of went their separate ways, and it was kind of the effort of trying to be together in an incredibly difficult moment or chapter in their lives and in their marriages that was the key to success for a lot of these couples that they were studying. And that's, I think, certainly one key to marital success. I mean, obviously, a related point, which you also touched on, Rebecca, is just the way in which, couples who are faithful, and who kind of can understand and appreciate how, God is with them and for them in the midst of some kind of profound difficulty or challenge, are also more successful when it comes to navigating these challenges as well. And so I think one reason why, for instance, we see less divorce among church-going Christians is that they do have, spiritual, social, emotional resources that they can draw on when times get tough. And for most of us who've been married, I've been married 29 years, for most of us, there are going to be plenty of times when things are tough in one way or another. And so to have the capacity to turn to one another when things are difficult, and to turn to God when things are difficult is, um, I think, no doubt from the research, and,
Yeah.
which is sort of my expertise, is linked to much greater success in navigating these slings and arrows of misfortune.
Mm.
Yeah, you talk about that in a section called "We Before Me," and I think that's a lot of what Rebecca and I why we wrote The Fight for Us is really to describe what does that look like to be we before me, because everything in the world's going to say it's all about you. Even in our fights, we sort of take on the assumption like, oh, it's not me that's causing the problem; it's got to be her, and reversing that and going, no, what about me is contributing to this, and how can I work on me so that we can have a better we is such an important idea. Well, I want to ask you one final question, really getting to this point of your book, Get Married. For young people today, is your advice to get married young? Like, if you find that great person and you're 18 years old, like, should people just move forward with this based on what you've seen in the data? Uh, and I know there's a lot of parents listening to this, right? They're trying to figure out, is it wise for my child to move forward in marriage, or should they delay till they've got a little more things figured out? What have you learned from that, and what's your opinion?
So, Gabe, what I see in the research that I've done and that I've looked at is sort of I would encourage couples to kind of get married in their 20s, broadly defined. And I wouldn't say, 25, I wouldn't say 21, I wouldn't say 29. I would just sort of say I think for most young adults, getting married in your 20s is a good idea. Now that's obviously predicated upon meeting someone who's a good friend, really, especially like with whom you have a lot in common. And so, I have, now that I'm in my early 50s, I've seen, long-term friends, including Christian friends, who got married and got divorced. And one of the things that I would kind of note about their particular situations is that, I mean, they were both, in these two examples, they were both Christians, both sets of couples are Christians, for instance, but they didn't have a lot in common as friends. And so what I would sort of say to both parents and to younger adults is you want to be ideally finding someone who shares your values, shares your faith, but also, shares a lot of core interests and commitments. Again, not everything, but that you have things to talk about that you can imagine when you're both old and ugly, that you'll still kind of enjoy one another's company, right? That's kind of an important thing to think about. And then in terms of the trajectory of the relationship, what we see is the couples who kind of move slowly, I would say, emotionally, spiritually, and physically, in their relationship are more likely to be flourishing once they are married. So you're kind of making sure that you're good friends, that you have symmetrical commitment, that you're, kind of broadly on the same page when it comes to what you're hoping to do, in your future as a couple. So that could start, when you're in high school. That could start when you're in college. That could start in your first job in your early 20s that you kind of meet someone and, but you're kind of taking the time in the relationship to establish a strong foundation of friendship and shared values and shared dreams. And then once you have that foundation, you can go forward with marriage in your early 20s, your mid 20s, your late 20s. Of course, some people today are going to experience difficulty meeting someone in their 20s. And so obviously in that context, again, I think I would encourage a 30-something person looking to get married just to look for, for friendship, for shared faith, and not to be too picky, if they really think that they're called to marriage and family life, as well. So those would be some general points I'd make about. In terms of just the research, what we do see is that kind of getting married in your mid-20s is linked to the happiest marriages. Getting married in your late 20s is linked to the most stable marriages, and this is for the entire adult population kind of in the US. But Christians who are getting married younger, who are attending church together, don't have that kind of elevated risk of divorce. And so again, I would say to both younger adults who are churchgoers and to their parents, that they should be open to getting married in their early 20s, so long as they have that foundation of mutual friendship and shared values, that would help to orient them as they kind of get launched into
Mhm.
family life.
I like that you added "and shared dreams." I think that's kind of what keeps the marriage alive, right? It's not yes, you're gonna keep, rolling in those values and that commitment, but are you still dreaming together in your 20s and your 30s and your 40s and your 50s? Are you still learning together? Are you still growing together? That curiosity, once that stays, I think it does create a culture of that keeps the marriage alive, it keeps it fresh, it keeps it vibrant
Right.
because you're never done, and that part is
Yeah.
exciting, I think.
Yeah. Well, Brad, we're so thankful for your work and faithfulness in sociology to report back this kind of data. It's encouraging to couples who are trying to navigate marriage, and it gives some additional motivation
Yeah.
to why we fight for our marriages and why we fight for one another. So I would encourage everybody listening to this, go pick up a copy of Get Married. It's such a great book to explain all the benefits, many more than we were able to talk about today, along with the data. And we're thankful for all of you who are committed to the fight for your marriage. It's important, not just for each other, but for society and evidently from Brad to save our civilization. So, Brad, thank you for being with us and encouraging us to these higher ends.
Yes, thank you for your work. I'm so grateful.